another question which I already popped in my head is that how is the critical thinking in foundation connected with the work of philosophers? Because critical thinking has the roots from Socrates and then from 2,500 years of history of philosophy. Is it connected or is it completely new body of knowledge?
This is a complex question, and I'll only give a brief answer to it. Therefore, it will not be an adequate answer. But a starting place is, as you mentioned, Socrates. So Socrates laid down some important parts of our framework for critical thinking. For example, he said, look, we need to focus more on asking questions rather than just assuming we understand. We need to probe thinking. We've got to find better ways for probing thinking. Socrates was very concerned with getting at the truth or at a reasonable conception of a concept, such as truth or such as piety, such as fairness. And so he was an expansive questioner, and he was also a person very seriously focused on the ideas or concepts that guide our thinking. And he said, in essence, this is not going to be a mathematical process. It's not going to be a simplified process. It's going to be complicated, and we've got to work out what this is, how to really approach thinking in the best ways. And then we have now a switch moving forward to Aristotelian logic, which is basically focused on syllogisms. If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. And this is, again, formal logic, which in essence comes down to us from that point through the philosophical schools as a primary approach to thinking. And in other words, the work of Socrates has been in many ways sidelined by mainstream philosophy. And there are many reasons for that. For one, Aristotelian logic or formal logic is quite simple. If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C, and all the kinds of formulas that you can create like that. But an important question becomes then, how does that formulaic way of thinking help you with your fill in the blank, with your everyday life experiences, with your relationship with your spouse, with your parenting? So the theories that are put forward to advance critical thinking have a lot to answer for, because they must provide the tools that we humans actually need in mundane everyday life, which again Socrates was focused on, mundane everyday life. So then moving on into the 20th century, the early 20th century, we begin to get a pushback within philosophy on the part of, for example, ordinary language philosophers who say we need to focus on the words that people use every day and how they use them. And we need to get our feet on the ground conceptually. And we want to also be careful not to be swept away by metaphysical ways of talking, which is another philosophical tradition. And so then we move forward, and as we move further into the 20th century, we begin to get major studies that show that in education or in schooling, that critical thinking is not being fostered to any significant degree. And now I'm talking about in the US, and there were two or more major studies, one which was entitled A Nation at Risk. And the idea there is our nation is at risk because students are not developing these critical thinking skills and abilities without using the term yet. So then we move on into the 1970s and 1980s, we begin to get the term critical thinking coming out of philosophy, coming out of academia at some beginning levels. And then you begin to see a turf war, in essence. And in the end, informal logic, or along the path, and for the specialty of informal logic within philosophy says we are critical thinking. We have critical thinking. So it becomes informal logic and critical thinking. But the theory that is being advanced within informal logic schools are mainly the same theories that we had before the critical thinking movement, theoretical movement of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and moving on forward. So that what counts as critical thinking, it is still now moving away a bit from formal logic. I believe philosophers have largely conceded that is passé. There's no evidence to show that if you're good at formal logic, you're good at reasoning in any other area of human life. And if there is, it's very limited. So that what has emerged is in informal logic is a focus on informal fallacies and argumentation theory fundamentally, and there may be other theories that are thrown in there. So fallacy theory is well and good. It will help us, and it can help us in many ways as thinkers if you understand the slippery slope or overgeneralization. And there's nothing wrong with well-developed argumentation theory. Of course, we want to, when we are making a case for something, we want to make the best case that we possibly can. In other words, arguing in the high sense. And so there's nothing wrong with those approaches as, I would say, secondary or peripheral approaches to critical thinking. But we still ask, what is the core of critical thinking? And so we're not looking at which theory do we like best. We're asking which theories of mind give us the most leverage to improve our thinking and to reason at the highest level of quality. And this is where the work of Richard Paul comes in, beginning and again fully in the 1980s and 90s, where Richard said, look, let's sit back from this and let's just ask some fundamental questions here. What is critical thinking? How does it make sense to even think of the term itself? How do we unpack that? And so and then what must a rich conception of critical thinking actually do for us? So what emerges from this is a rich set of core tools of critical thinking that Richard and those of us in the school of thought in which we work, we continue to advance these tools, but we consider them at the core of any substantive conception of critical thinking.
Okay, thank you. I know it's a very complicated and complex, let's say, issue. So thank you for this, let's say, pretty short information. And I see how it's connected.